At its peak, it was the largest empire in human history. It covered 24% of the Earth's land surface and ruled over 400 million people. Somewhere on Earth, it was always daytime on British territory, giving the phrase "the empire on which the sun never sets" a literal geographic meaning. But to understand how this happened, you have to look at what Britain was in the 1400s. It was a minor, rainy kingdom on the edge of Europe, largely irrelevant compared to superpowers like Spain, Portugal, and France. What Britain did have, however, were two distinct advantages: a rapidly developing navy and a relentless hunger for global trade. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to a group called the East India Company. This was a private trading corporation, legally authorized to act on behalf of the Crown, that became the primary vehicle for Britain's global ambitions. This empire grew from commercial trade into military conquest. Once commerce was backed by gunships, it evolved into total global domination, and the world would never be the same again. This map illustrates the brutal economic engine that built modern British wealth, the triangle of trade. British ships carried manufactured goods to West Africa, exchanged them for enslaved people, and then forced those captives to harvest sugar and cotton in the Americas. The profits sailed directly back to Britain. The journey across the Atlantic was known as the Middle Passage. Between 1640 and 1807, Britain transported over 3 million enslaved Africans in unimaginable conditions, as seen in this historical cross-section of the Brooks slave ship. These massive profits funded the infrastructure of modern Britain, its stately homes, its banks, and its oldest universities. Britain officially abolished the slave trade in 1807, but to pass the law, the government paid massive financial compensation to the slave owners, not the enslaved. The British public only finished paying off that debt to slave owners in 2015. Long before it ruled nations, the initial wealth and power of the empire was bankrolled by the systematic extraction of human life. By the mid-1700s, the focus shifted to India. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company transitioned from a private trading operation into a sovereign ruler, conquering the subcontinent piece by piece using private mercenary armies. In 1857, Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, rose up in what the British called the Indian Mutiny, and what Indians recognized as their first war of independence. This great rebellion was crushed with extreme systematic violence by the British military. In the immediate aftermath, the British Crown took direct control, dismantling the trading company entirely and declaring Queen Victoria the Empress of India. Looking at this chart, you can see the scale of what happened next. Economists estimate the equivalent of $45 trillion were drained out of India and funneled into the British treasury over 2 centuries. India provided the cotton, tea, spices, and soldiers that made Britain the richest nation on earth, while systematically impoverishing a region that was once highly prosperous. By the late 1800s, European powers turned their attention southward in the scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, diplomats sat around a table to divide the entire continent between themselves. This map shows the result. Borders were drawn with rulers, completely ignoring existing tribes, languages, and cultures, and there wasn't a single African person at the table to represent them. Looking at this map of the world, you can see this cartographic conquest reached its absolute apex in 1913. Every territory in stark red, from Canada to Kenya to Malaysia, was under British control. It established a global hierarchy where a single, small island dictated the physical and economic reality of 1 in 4 people on Earth. The First World War shattered the imperial facade. Over 1 million colonial subjects fought and died for Britain, believing their sacrifice would finally earn their nations greater rights and respect. Those expectations were betrayed. In 1919, British troops fired into a crowd of unarmed Indian civilians at the Amritsar massacre, killing nearly 400 people. The massacre triggered an explosion of resistance movements worldwide. In India, Mahatma Gandhi launched his massive nonviolent campaign for independence. But not all resistance was nonviolent, and the British response was often severe. During the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, colonial authorities forced thousands into brutal detention camps. The fractures were hitting closer to home, too. In Ireland, the 1916 Easter Rising sparked a bloody war of independence and eventual partition. The Second World War finished what the First had started. Britain emerged victorious, but the conflict left the country entirely bankrupt and deeply indebted to the United States. The empire could no longer afford the military, financial, or moral cost required to hold down a world demanding its freedom. Between 1947 and 1980, decolonization happened with staggering speed. An empire that took 400 years to build collapsed in just 50. The handover of power was often rushed and disastrous. The 1947 partition of India triggered one of the largest mass migrations in history, killing up to 2 million people. The definitive symbolic end finally arrived in 1997, when Britain handed Hong Kong back to China and lowered the Union Jack. The British Empire left behind a deeply complex legacy. It spread railways and legal systems and the English language to every corner of the earth. But it also delivered systemic slavery, widespread famine, and extreme violence. When you look at a map of the modern world, its drawn borders, its concentrated wealth, and its deep inequalities, you are looking at the direct, unavoidable legacy of one small island's extraordinary and terrible empire.